So the Forde report has finally been released after 2 years? Now, my broad take on it is that it's mostly fair. I've got some issues with it, which I will go into. But what does it say? Yes, the Labour right did use anti-Semitism as a weapon against Jeremy Corbyn and the left. That is categorically true. Now, in the Labour leaks, there was a claim that there was a shadow campaign in the 2017 general election. In the Forde report, that is categorically true. We can see that £135,000 worth of campaign funds was siphoned to a secret campaign. Now, that money went on anti-Corbyn MPs. Lotto had no idea this was going on. So it's not conspiracy theory, no matter what many in the legacy media say, or what Keir Starmer's top team is saying. It is true. Now, we already knew all of this, but it's nice to have it confirmed in black and white. The problem we have is that mainstream journos are turning a blind eye, or they're categorically lying about what's in the report. Now, contrary to what the Labour right was saying, contrary to what the mainstream media narrative was, the left in the party was not downplaying anti-Semitism. So what this report categorically says is there's a lack of professionalism from the Labour right, and there was a culture of abuse and attacks. Now, check out this quote. This is unbelievable. This should not be in a main political party. Of particular concern for me as I commenced work at Southside was the regular ringing of bells and cheering throughout the working day, on commenting that there seemed to be a lot of birthdays among colleagues. I was advised that the bell ringing was conducted by the compliance unit and represented the successful suspension or expulsion of a member, often surrounded by the description of such members as trots. A large member of staff across most teams were actively involved in trawling members, post holders and potential candidates' social media accounts, seeking evidence that might be used against them, although it was unclear to me whether this was as volunteers or on a specific request from the compliance unit. This is outright childish behaviour. Now, these people who are currently controlling the party, I couldn't trust these people as far as I could throw them. So I'm going to go for the main points and the main takeaway from the Forde report, starting with this one. Some senior HQ staff had the ability to implement resourcing decisions covertly. A handful of staff in Ergon House created an additional fund for printing costs under code GEL001, spending some £135,000 in total on campaigns supportive of sitting largely anti-Corbyn MPs, and not on campaigns for pro-Corbyn candidates in potentially Tory winnable seats. So contrary to what the legacy media is saying, and contrary to their spin on this report, you can see here in black and white, there was a shadow campaign. There was funds being used to undermine the elected leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. This was during a general election. Everyone should be getting behind the leader. You don't have to agree on policy, or every policy anyway. You can agree that he's a disaster of a leader. But siphoning off funds, Now that is disgraceful. We've also got a quote from a senior HQ staff, and he said, "Some of my former colleagues did like to play games, so they thought they were getting one over the other side. If they had been more politically aligned to the leadership, they would have got more approval of what they were doing. But they thought they knew best. They did not think Lotto would agree that distrust meant communication didn't occur." Now that was in regards to over 130 grand of campaign funds being diverted, going into more anti-Corbyn seats during the 2017 general election. Most of the MPs were from the right or the centre right of the party, and none of them were supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. The report also found that some of the attitudes in Labour HQ were disappointed that Labour were rising in the polls. In short, they considered that a bad result was inevitable, deeply regrettable, and would be the start of a period of rebuilding. When the polls began to tighten and it became apparent that some of their assumptions had been wrong, many reacted with incredulity and deflation. Now remember the EHRC report, and that I've read the report from cover to cover. I've also read this report from cover to cover, so I know what I'm talking about, not mainstream corporate journalists who are just retweeting Labour HQ, who haven't actually read it. In the EHRC report, it claims that Jeremy Corbyn broke rules because he personally intervened in anti-Semitism cases. Then they tried to paint the picture that Corbyn aggressively intervened in cases in which he, tried to stop suspension on his so-called allies. Now, that would be bad. You would intervene in a case where someone close to you, one of your allies, someone who's politically to the left just like you intervene to stop a suspension from happening because they're your mate, regardless if they've done something wrong or not. That would be wrong. That's why all over the media, Jeremy Corbyn got dragged through the mud, and many called Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic and blah, 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 you know the story. But this is very, very interesting. In the Forde report, it actually undermines what the EHRC was saying. As the EHRC identified, there was undue and improper involvement of Lotto in a limited number of high-profile disciplinary cases in which they should have had no substantive involvement. That is rightly to be deplored. We also understand that GLU staff felt that they were generally under political pressure from Lotto and their allies not to find certain individuals guilty of anti-Semitism. However, we have not received clear and convincing documentary evidence that there was a systemic attempt by the elected leadership or Lotto to interfere unbidden in the disciplinary process in order to undermine the party's response to allegations of anti-Semitism. So right there it says there is no evidence that Jeremy Corbyn or Lotto tried to intervene in anti-Semitism cases. So this looks like an absolute outright fabrication in which it was repeated in the EHRC, in which the mainstream media repeated the EHRC to attack Jeremy Corbyn. Now, aside from the factional issues in which the right tried to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, there was a huge issue with discrimination, especially against Muslims or anti-black racism. And this obviously has been going on for a long time, which has been swept under the rug. Largely the media haven't really spoken about it. But this is what the Forde report has to say on discrimination in the Labour Party. 3 dimensions of our inquiry led us to conclude that there are serious problems of discrimination in the operations of the party. The undoubted over and underlying racism and sexism apparent in some of the content of the WhatsApp messages between the party's most senior staff. Other themes included concerns that the attention to the surge of cases related to anti-Semitism and the importance they appeared to play in the interfactional conflict meant that the party was, in effect, operating a hierarchy of racism or discrimination, with other forms of racism and discrimination being ignored. Now, even before this report, if you would say on mainstream media, there is a hierarchy of racism in society, there's a hierarchy of racism in the Labour Party, it doesn't downplay anti-Semitism. As we all say, one anti-Semite is too many, but don't forget about anti-black racism, don't forget about Islamophobia, don't forget about sexism, don't forget about all forms of discrimination. Then there are some forces of the media that will say, you are downplaying anti-Semitism, you're an anti-Semite. Many people have said, it's just an all lives matter for the left. Well, you can see categorically right here, right now, Martin Forde QC has said, and his team, that there is a hierarchy of racism in the Labour Party. So don't shit on us on the left, don't shit on the socialists. Come after this guy, come after this team after a 2-year-long investigation. Now we can see clearly there's rife Islamophobia and anti-black racism in the Labour Party. Just look at the leadership. We've only had a white guy lead the Labour Party. Even look at the Conservatives. As horrible as they are, you've got to hand it to them. They've done better on equality when it comes to the leadership positions. They might potentially have their third female prime minister, or they might have their first person of colour prime minister. What does the Labour Party have to say? In fact, they decide to rig the rules to make it harder for BAME people to get on the leadership ballot, to become leader of the Labour Party. What does that say about the Labour Party? What does it say that you've got Muslim MPs, female Muslim MPs, getting trigger balloted after they've gone through abuse? Where's the defence of these people here? What about Islamophobia being directed to people like Absama Begum and Zara Sultana, and the leadership not calling it out, just completely ignoring it? Now, I can go through more if you like. We've got comments. Have a look at this one. Comments that Diane Abbott literally makes me sick. It's truly repulsive and is a very angry woman. Discussions, according to the report, discussions about the attire of junior female staff, in which one is said to be wearing a see-through flesh-coloured skin-tight top and no bra. Do you think with all that money, she could afford to buy a jacket and a bra? And descriptions of Carrie Murphy as a crazy woman, as a bitch-faced cow, as well as comments about her physical appearance. The report here finds criticisms of Diane Abbott are not simply a harsh response to perceived poor performance. They are expressions of visceral disgust, drawing consciously or otherwise on racist tropes, and they bear little resemblance to the criticisms of white male MPs elsewhere in the messages. Does that sound like a progressive party to you? Does that sound like a faction? Because this came from the political right in the Labour Party. Does it sound like they have any authority to talk about anti-racism? This is an utterly dysfunctional Labour Party. And what Jeremy Corbyn tried to do was change politics, was to change the structure of the Labour Party from what we have is people being hired because they're mates, people being hired in positions because they're close, to a much more people-powered movement, to open up the structures of the Labour Party, to rip away power from the machine and give it to ordinary members. Not only is that good in terms of democracy, but that also gives more diverse voices and more diverse people. In the report, it literally says the fact that Labour HQ is completely white dominated. And there are examples of black women or black people struggling to climb the ladder within the Labour Party because there's still discrimination against them. And that opening up, and the membership is far more diverse, and that Labour HQ doesn't reflect the diversity of the membership. Jeremy Corbyn wanted the party to be defined by its membership. My God, the guy isn't perfect. I've got criticism too. Obviously, there was issues with anti-Semitism within the party, which obviously predated Jeremy Corbyn, and it had somewhat improved under him, but nowhere near enough. And of course, he didn't change the culture in which black people in the Labour Party who wanted to progress felt like they were being held back because of their colour. Of course, I blame Jeremy Corbyn for not addressing that either, but this isn't just him. This is the whole political party. This is the whole culture within the party. And he just tried to wrestle power away from those at the top to give it to the members. I think the Labour right are utterly, demonstrably disgraceful. They are happy to smear anyone, to use a Jewish person's identity to attack your political opponent. If you want to call Jeremy Corbyn an idiot, if you want to say his politics are fantasy, if you want to call him incompetent, fine, that's okay. Don't have to be a Corbynite. Don't have to agree with his policies. Bear in mind, the Labour Party is supposed to be a broad church, right? But to smear a man who fought his whole life against racism, when there is so much racism going on within the HQ of the party, within the cliques of the Blairite groups, how do you have any authority to do that? Have a look at this. This is from a political party that wants to govern us. The sensibles are now back in power. The staff at Labour HQ have a tradition of having socials at a pub called the Colonies in Victoria, which is a relic to and celebration of the UK's colonial past. Given the number of drinking establishments within the square mile of Labour HQ, you would think that Labour employees would recognise how deeply offensive and alienating to Asian and African staff members this is. These socials were advertised widely through the Labour Party's social club. So what lessons can we learn from this? Well, if you work in the mainstream media, clearly nothing. So Blairite ghoul John Rentoul had this to say on Twitter. JC, right as usual. His crew went far beyond normal factionalism. Basically, a Communist Party of Britain SWP takeover of Labour. These are utterly unserious people, yet they're getting paid a shitload to espouse crap opinions like this. We've got two tweets, both mainstream journalists. They say the exact same thing, with no quotation marks. New, Labour sources say Forde report completely debunks the conspiracy theory. The 2017 general election was deliberately sabotaged by party staff opposed to Corbyn's leadership. Now, the way that tweet is framed just looks like that they've gone in and looked at it and thought, you know what, don't bother reading the report. We know the left are at fault here. It's a conspiracy. There was nothing to undermine the left. It's all their fault. So some of my issues I have with the report is they try to both sides of the issue. This is where I highly criticise it, because you can't both sides this issue. One faction, the Labour right, weaponised anti-Semitism against the left. The left said, hey, we're not anti-Semites. So then there's a couple of lines in the Forde report that says, well, it looks like the left are trying to downplay anti-Semitism or deny it. No one within the left, in the Labour Party, the Labour left, nothing in the leaked report said that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. No one tried to downplay it. They just simply said, hey, look, these guys are trying to use anti-Semitism smears against us, and that's not right. So the Forde report, unfortunately, basically just says, well, it's a factional battle in which anti-Semitism was thrown back and forth. That's not the case. But of course, we've got good old Luke Akehurst, or Luke Nukem as I like to call him, tweet out and say this: I personally find the both sides discourse on anti-Semitism really offensive. There's no moral equivalence between factionalism fighting anti-Semitism and factionalism whitewashing it. Well, actually, do you know what? I agree with him. You're right. The Labour right did use anti-Semitism as a smear against the left, and the left tried to fight it. In fact, we know that Ian McNicol sat on anti-Semitism cases in order to make the leadership look worse. The main takeaway or recommendation from the Forde report is, hey, can't we all just get on? Clearly, the Labour Party is supposed to be a broad church. Why can't you come to some common ground and consensus? Well, first of all, how can you come to a common ground when the current leadership of the Labour Party is purging left-wing members? These are two political parties in one. The political right within the Labour Party see the left, see socialists as enemies. They see them as more enemies than the Tories, which is why they would rather a Tory government than a socialist-led or Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government. So thank God that those who weaponise racism against a faction they just didn't particularly like. Thank God that they referred to members who just wanted a different kind of politics as trots. Thank God that those that were racist about Diane Abbott were laughing at that she was crying in a toilet. Thank God that those people are back in charge in the Labour Party. So there's going to be no lessons learned from this. Instead, we're just going to get more factional warfare against the left. We're going to get the Labour leadership and his friends in the media, his close friends in The Guardian, The Observer, basically say what they want it to say, the Forde report, even though it's completely untruthful. They pulled it out of their arses, and they're just going to run with it. They're not going to actually look into this and think, holy fuck, we've made some issues here. Maybe we can try and allow the party to be a bit more open and democratise and allow socialists to actually, the ones that fucking helped create the Labour Party, be inside it. That's not going to happen because Keir Starmer's political project is about destroying the left. That has been his main political project from day one. So, of course, he's not going to look at this report and take any lessons from it because he doesn't want to do that. So, this is the state of the Labour Party. The worst offenders in the Forde report are now running the Labour Party.